You know, sometimes life has a way of turning your peaceful world upside down when you least expect it. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but what happened to my family farm wasn't just about land, it was about standing up to corruption that tried to masquerade as progress. Before I tell you how an HOA Karen tried to steal my farm under the guise of public use, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring that bell. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this story ends. Let me take you back to where it all began. I'm Jim Miller, and for 3 generations, my family has worked this land just outside of Riverdale. 60 acres of organic crops, heritage apple orchards, and some of the richest soil you'll find in the Midwest. I spent 30 years as an agricultural science professor at State, but my real passion was always right here, working the land my grandfather bought during the Great Depression. After my wife Sarah passed 5 years ago, my daughter Emma moved back home. She brought her agricultural research background with her, and together we turned this place into a model of sustainable farming. We supply fresh produce to local schools, run educational programs for kids, and even host a weekly farmers market that brings the whole community together. The farm sits at the edge of what used to be rural country, but over the years, the suburbs have crept closer. Still, we were grandfathered in, protected by agricultural zoning laws, and our property rights were rock solid. At least, that's what I thought until that black Mercedes pulled up my driveway one Tuesday morning. Victoria Blackwood stepped out, like she owned the place. Designer heels sinking into the soft dirt of my driveway. She introduced herself as the new president of the Pine Grove Estates Homeowners Association. I'd heard about the luxury development they'd built about a mile and down the road, but I never imagined it would have anything to do with us. "Mr. Miller," she said, her smile never reaching her eyes, "I'm here to discuss the future of Riverdale. Your farm has been incorporated into our district's expansion plan. We're launching an exciting community development project, and your property has been designated for public use." I remember standing there, mud still fresh on my boots from the morning's work, trying to make sense of what she was saying. I dealt with developers before, usually trying to buy us out for their next cookie-cutter subdivision. But this was different. This wasn't an offer. This was someone telling me they had already decided my farm's fate. Emma came out of the greenhouse just then, and I saw Blackwood's expression shift. She clearly hadn't expected to deal with someone who had a PhD in agricultural sciences and a background in land use law. My daughter took one look at the situation and knew something wasn't right. "We've reviewed the zoning regulations," Blackwood continued, pulling out a thick folder. "Your property falls within our new community planning zone. The HOA board has voted to convert this space into a public recreation area. We're thinking walking trails, a community center, maybe even a golf course." I've spent enough time in academia to recognize bureaucratic doublespeak when I hear it. This wasn't about public use. This was about private interests trying to steal land that had been in my family for generations. Land that fed hundreds of families, that preserved heritage farming techniques, that stood as one of the last working farms in our county. What Victoria Blackwood didn't know was that she had just picked a fight with the wrong farmer. I might look like a simple man who works the land, but I've got 3 decades of research experience and a network of agricultural experts behind me. And my daughter, she's even more determined than I am. After Victoria Blackwood's black Mercedes disappeared down our gravel driveway, Emma and I spent the evening poring over every document we could find related to our property. The thick manila folder Blackwood had left behind contained what she called community integration notices, page after page of bureaucratic language designed to obscure their true intentions. The more we read, the more our concern grew. Emma spread the papers across our old oak dining table, her researcher's instincts kicking in as she began categorizing each document. The HOA claimed they had conducted environmental impact studies, obtained necessary rezoning approvals, and secured community support for their agricultural land repurposing initiative. But something didn't add up. "Dad, look at these dates," Emma said, pointing to a series of town hall meetings where our farm's fate had supposedly been discussed. "These meetings happened 6 months ago, but we never received any notification. How can they make decisions about our property without our involvement?" I pulled out our deed and land records, documents I'd kept meticulously organized since taking over the farm from my father. Our agricultural zoning status was clear, our property rights well documented. The HOA's claims about having jurisdiction over our land seemed to contradict every legal protection we had in place. The next morning, we received our first official notice. A stark white envelope with Pine Grove Estates' gold-embossed logo arrived in our mailbox. Inside was a detailed list of violations they'd identified during their property assessment. Our irrigation systems weren't up to community standards. Our equipment storage violated aesthetic guidelines. Even our heritage apple orchard was deemed inconsistent with the neighborhood's architectural vision. Emma photographed every page, her hands shaking with anger. "They're trying to manufacture problems, Dad. Create a paper trail to justify whatever they're planning." We weren't going to wait to find out what that might be. I called Maria Rodriguez, our neighbor who owned the vegetable farm adjacent to ours. She'd been here even longer than we had, and if anyone knew about local land disputes, it would be her. Maria arrived within the hour, her truck kicking up dust as she parked next to our barn. The moment she saw the HOA document spread across our kitchen table, her expression darkened. "The Blackwoods," she said, shaking her head. "They tried this 2 counties over last year, turned 3 family farms into a luxury golf resort, called it community improvement then too. That information changed everything. This wasn't just about our farm anymore. It was part of a pattern." Emma immediately started researching Victoria Blackwood's development history, while I reached out to contacts at the university's agricultural department. Within days, we'd uncovered a web of similar cases, small farms and agricultural lands, mysteriously falling under new HOA jurisdictions, followed by mounting pressure to sell. But the HOA wasn't waiting for us to connect the dots. A week after Blackwood's visit, they began their campaign in earnest. Every morning brought new violations, each more absurd than the last. Our farm stand was suddenly unauthorized commerce. The educational tours we provided to local schools were deemed disruptive to community peace. They even claimed our roosters violated noise ordinances. The pressure wasn't just bureaucratic. Strange cars began appearing along our property, line occupants taking photos and making notes. Our regular customers reported being stopped and questioned about their relationships with our farm. Some even received letters suggesting our produce might not meet community health standards. Emma documented everything, setting up security cameras and keeping detailed records of every interaction. But it was a chance encounter at the local coffee shop that gave us our first real break. The barista, overhearing Emma discussing our situation, mentioned that her cousin worked for the county zoning office. "You might want to look into the Pine Grove Estates expansion permits," she whispered. "There's been talk about irregularities in their applications." That tip led us to Mark Chen, an environmental law attorney who'd been investigating similar cases across the state. We met him at his downtown office, bringing our growing file of evidence. Chen listened intently as we laid out the timeline, his expression growing more focused with each detail we shared. "They're operating from a familiar playbook," he explained, pulling up similar cases on his computer. "These aren't random acts of harassment. It's a systematic approach to forcing out agricultural operations. They create paper trails of violations, manufacture community complaints, and then use that documentation to justify their actions to local authorities. But what made our case different, Chen pointed out, was the evidence we'd already gathered. The dated violations that predated their claimed jurisdiction. The environmental impact studies that couldn't possibly have been conducted during the time frame they specified. The community meetings that no one in the actual community remembered attending. They're usually more careful than this, Chen said, reviewing our documentation. They've gotten sloppy, probably because they've gotten away with it so many times before, but that sloppiness gives us an advantage. As we left Chen's office that afternoon, we felt something we hadn't since this ordeal began. Hope. We had confirmation that we weren't imagining things, that this wasn't just about our farm, and most importantly, that we could fight back. Emma spent that evening creating a secure digital archive of everything we'd collected. If they're willing to go this far already, she reasoned, we need to make sure our evidence is protected. She wasn't being paranoid. The very next day, we discovered someone had attempted to access our property records at the county clerk's office. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The HOA's next move proved they were getting desperate. A formal letter arrived stating that our property had been selected for emergency environmental assessment due to numerous community complaints about agricultural runoff. They demanded immediate access to conduct soil testing, citing regulations that didn't exist. We were ready for them. Thanks to Emma's foresight, we had our own comprehensive soil analysis from an independent laboratory, conducted just months earlier as part of her research project. We also had documentation of our organic certification, water quality reports, and environmental impact studies spanning the last decade. Mark Chen helped us draft our response, a carefully worded letter that not only refused their demand for access but also put them on notice that we were aware of their pattern of harassment. We included copies of our environmental certifications and requested copies of these supposed community complaints. Their reaction told us everything we needed to know about the legitimacy of their claims. Instead of providing the requested documentation, Victoria Blackwood herself showed up at our farm the next morning, this time with two men in suits who refused to identify themselves. They demanded to speak with me, but found Emma instead, who had her phone ready to record the entire interaction. "You're making this much more difficult than it needs to be," Blackwood said, her practiced smile now replaced with barely concealed frustration. "The community has certain expectations about property use and appearances. Your continued resistance is becoming problematic." Emma's response was calm, but firm. "We've documented every interaction, every letter, and every false claim you've made against our property. We've also been in touch with other farmers who've dealt with similar tactics from your organization. Would you like to explain why your environmental impact studies are dated before your HOA even existed?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Blackwood and her associates retreated to their car, leaving behind only a vague threat about further legal action. But we knew we'd struck a nerve. The question now wasn't if they would retaliate, but how. The retaliation came swiftly, but not in the way we expected. Early one morning, just as the sun was beginning to peek over our eastern fields, a fleet of official-looking vehicles rolled onto our property. Men in hazmat suits emerged, carrying sampling equipment and posting warning signs about potential environmental hazards. They had county logos on their jackets, but something felt off about the whole operation. Emma was already on the phone with Mark Chen before they reached our main field. The inspectors claimed they were responding to reports of dangerous pesticide use and soil contamination. What they didn't expect was Emma's immediate response. She walked straight up to their team leader and demanded to see their county credentials, authorization paperwork, and the specific testing protocols they planned to use. The man fumbled with his clipboard, clearly unprepared for someone who knew exactly what legitimate environmental testing procedures looked like. When Emma pointed out that their supposed testing equipment wasn't properly calibrated for agricultural soil sampling, the team's confidence began to crack. One of the younger inspectors actually removed his hazmat suit and walked off, wanting no part of what was clearly becoming a fraudulent inspection. Maria Rodriguez arrived just then, having seen the commotion from her property. She had her teenage son recording everything on his phone while she called the real county environmental office. Within 20 minutes, we had confirmation. There was no official inspection scheduled for our farm. The team quickly packed up and left, but not before Emma photographed their vehicle license plates and company logos. Through his legal connections, Mark Chen traced the fake inspection team to a private environmental consulting firm, one that had done multiple contracts for Victoria Blackwood's previous development projects. They had been hired to create the appearance of environmental violations, laying groundwork for the HOA to claim our farm posed a threat to the community. But the failed inspection attempt was just the beginning. That afternoon, local news websites suddenly featured articles about community concerns over our farming practices. The stories were vague but suggestive, hinting at health risks and environmental dangers without making any specific claims. Social media posts began appearing, warning people about buying produce from our farm stand. What the HOA didn't count on was our community's response. Our regular customers, many of whom had been buying our produce for years, began posting their own stories. They shared photos of their children learning about organic farming during our educational tours, testimonials about our sustainable practices, and fierce defenses of our farm's role in the community. The local farmers market organizers, where we'd been vendors for over 2 decades, issued a public statement supporting us and confirming our impeccable food safety record. Even the school district, which sourced produce for their farm-to-table lunch program from us, spoke up about our farm's educational value and commitment to community health. This groundswell of support seemed to push Victoria Blackwood into a corner. Her next move revealed just how desperate she was becoming. The HOA filed an emergency injunction, claiming our farm constituted a public nuisance and demanding immediate cessation of all agricultural activities pending a full environmental review. Mark Chen was ready for this. The lawsuit was filled with inconsistencies, environmental data that couldn't possibly have been collected, community complaints from addresses that didn't exist, and violations of regulations that had been outdated. For years, but what really caught our attorney's attention was a small detail buried in the filing, a reference to a development plan dated 3 years before the HOA even existed. Emma spent a full night digging through online records, following a trail that led to a series of shell companies and hidden real estate transactions. The picture that emerged was stunning. Victoria Blackwood's HOA was just the public face of a much larger operation. They had been systematically targeting family farms across 3 states using manufactured environmental concerns and fraudulent HOA jurisdictions to force owners to sell. The next morning, we received an unexpected visitor. A young man in a business suit introduced himself as a former employee of Blackwood's development company. He had documentation, internal memos, email correspondence, and meeting minutes showing that the entire HOA expansion was part of a predetermined plan to acquire agricultural properties for a massive resort development. They pick farms near growing suburban areas, he explained, hands shaking as he shared his files, create fake HOA jurisdictions, manufacture violations, pressure the owners until they give up. They've done it 6 times in the last 2 years. I couldn't be part of it anymore. With this new evidence, Mark Chen prepared our counterattack. Instead of just defending against their injunction, we filed our own lawsuit. We alleged conspiracy to defraud, documenting every false claim, every manufactured violation, and every instance of harassment. But more importantly, we included evidence of their broader pattern of targeting family farms. The story caught the attention of a national farming advocacy group, which offered to join our lawsuit as co-plaintiffs. They had been tracking similar cases across the country, but had never been able to gather enough evidence to prove the systematic nature of these land grabs. Victoria Blackwood made one last attempt to maintain control. She appeared at our farm, unannounced, this time with what she claimed was a generous buyout offer. The amount was substantial, enough to relocate and start over somewhere else. But as she laid out the terms, her true desperation showed through. The offer came with strict confidentiality clauses and a requirement to withdraw all our legal claims. I thought about my grandfather, who'd bought this land when nobody else wanted it. About my father, who'd transformed it into a model of sustainable agriculture. About Emma, who was carrying our family's legacy into a new era of farming. The decision wasn't hard. "Ms. Blackwood," I said, watching her perfectly maintained facade crack just slightly, "this farm isn't for sale. Not now, not ever. And by the time we're done, everyone will know exactly what you've been doing to family farms like ours." She left without another word, but we could feel the storm coming. We just didn't realize how many others had been waiting for someone to finally stand up to Victoria Blackwood and her fraudulent HOA scheme. The tension in our small farming community reached its breaking point on a crisp autumn morning. A convoy of construction vehicles appeared at the edge of our property, accompanied by several Pine Grove Estates security vehicles. They began setting up surveying equipment along our property line, completely ignoring the no trespassing signs Emma had installed. Emma, who had been checking on our newly planted winter wheat, immediately began recording with her phone. The workers claimed they were conducting a mandatory infrastructure assessment for future community development. When she demanded to see their permits, they produced documents with obvious irregularities, dates that didn't match, incorrect property coordinates, and signatures from officials who had retired years ago. Within minutes, Maria Rodriguez and several other neighboring farmers arrived, having seen the commotion. They parked their tractors in a line, creating a barrier between our fields and the surveyors. The show of solidarity caught the HOA's crew off guard. These weren't just farmers, they were families who had worked this land for generations, and they understood exactly what was at stake. Mark Chen rushed to the scene, accompanied by 2 county officials he had contacted. The surveyors' permits were quickly exposed as forgeries, forcing them to pack up and leave. But not before Emma had documented everything, including close-ups of their fraudulent paperwork and company identifications. That evening, while reviewing the day's footage, Emma noticed something crucial. One of the surveying company's trucks had a logo we'd seen before. It matched a subsidiary company mentioned in the whistleblower's documents. This wasn't just another harassment attempt. They were actively planning development before any legal proceedings had concluded. Our attorney wasted no time. He filed an emergency motion documenting the HOA's latest attempted incursion, complete, with evidence of their forged permits. But what happened next revealed just how deep the corruption went. The judge assigned to our case suddenly recused himself, citing a previously undisclosed conflict of interest. We later discovered he had financial ties to one of Blackwood's development companies. The story took an unexpected turn when local media finally began digging deeper. A young investigative reporter, following up on tips from other farmers who had lost their land to similar schemes, uncovered a pattern of suspicious zoning changes. Each time, the same sequence played out: HOAs would expand their boundaries without proper notification. Environmental concerns would suddenly arise, and within months, family farms would be forced to sell. Victoria Blackwood's response was swift and aggressive. She held a press conference at the Pine Grove Estates clubhouse, presenting elaborate plans for what she called an eco-friendly community development project. The renderings showed walking trails, community gardens, and green spaces, all carefully designed to make our farm's destruction seem like environmental progress. But we had an ace up our sleeve. Emma had been working with agricultural students from her old university, documenting our farm's crucial role in local food security. They produced a comprehensive report showing how our organic farming methods actually improved soil quality and supported local wildlife. More importantly, they calculated the economic impact of losing productive farmland to development. The county commissioners couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. They launched a formal investigation into the HOA's expansion claims and zoning irregularities. During a packed public hearing, farmers from across the state testified about similar experiences with Blackwood's organization. The pattern was undeniable. Then came the anonymous emails. Someone inside Pine Grove Estates began sending us internal HOA documents, minutes from secret board meetings, financial records showing suspicious transfers, and emails discussing strategies to pressure farmers into selling. The source remained hidden, but their information was solid gold. These documents revealed something even more disturbing. Victoria Blackwood wasn't just targeting our farm, she was planning to use it as a precedent. If they succeeded in forcing us out through their fraudulent HOA claims, they would replicate the strategy across the entire agricultural belt surrounding the city. Mark Chen brought this evidence to the State Attorney General's office. The scope of the scheme, spanning multiple counties and involving millions in fraudulent property transactions, elevated the case beyond local jurisdiction. State investigators began examining every property deal Blackwood's organizations had been involved with over the past 5 years. The pressure began showing cracks in the HOA's facade. Board members started resigning, claiming they had been misled about the true nature of the expansion plans. Several admitted they had never actually voted on the measures Blackwood claimed had unanimous support. Victoria made one last, desperate play. She attempted to call an emergency HOA meeting to vote on using their legal fund, money collected from legitimate homeowners' dues, to fight our lawsuit. But she hadn't counted on those same homeowners learning the truth about how their fees were being used. The meeting turned into a revolt. Residents of Pine Grove Estates, many of whom had bought into the community because of its promised green spaces and sustainability initiatives, were horrified to learn they had been unwitting participants in a scheme to destroy local farms. They demanded Blackwood's immediate resignation. Instead of stepping down, she doubled down. New violation notices appeared on our property daily, each more outrageous than the last. She hired private security to photograph everyone entering or leaving our farm stand. She even attempted to have our road access declared restricted, claiming it was now private HOA property. But her tactics were becoming increasingly transparent. Local law enforcement, now aware of the pattern of harassment, began responding to our calls immediately. They documented each incident, building a case that went far beyond simple property disputes. The tide was turning, but we knew the real battle was still ahead. Victoria Blackwood had built her career on destroying family farms like ours, and she wouldn't give up easily. As we prepared for the court hearing that would determine not just our fate, but the future of every family farm in the region, we discovered just how far she was willing to go to protect her empire of lies. Late one evening, while I was reviewing documentation with Emma in our farmhouse office, Maria Rodriguez's son burst through the door, out of breath. He had been helping with their evening rounds when he spotted several figures moving through our apple orchard, carrying what looked like containers. By the time we grabbed our flashlights and rushed out, the intruders were gone, but they had left behind something far more sinister. In the soft earth between our heritage apple trees, we found fresh chemical residue. Laboratory tests would later confirm our worst fears. They had attempted to contaminate our soil with toxic substances, clearly planning to use it as evidence of environmental violations. The police arrived within minutes, and this time they treated it as a serious crime scene. The attempted sabotage had crossed a line from harassment into criminal activity. What the perpetrators hadn't realized was that Emma had recently installed motion-activated wildlife cameras throughout the orchard as part of her agricultural research. The footage was grainy in the low light, but clear enough to identify two men who had been present at previous HOA inspections. Mark Chen immediately filed for criminal charges. The next morning, Victoria Blackwood called an emergency press conference. Standing in front of Pine Grove Estate's pristine clubhouse, she denounced the unfounded accusations against her organization and announced their intent to file a defamation lawsuit against our family. But there was something different about her demeanor. A subtle tremor in her voice, a nervousness in her usually confident stance. Her performance might have been convincing, if not for what happened next. One of the men identified in our orchard, footage facing criminal charges, decided to save himself. He arrived at Mark Chen's office with a thumb drive containing emails, contracts, and recorded conversations. He had been Blackwood's fixer for years, handling the dirty work of their farm acquisition scheme. The evidence was damning. Detailed plans for targeting specific farms, strategies for manufacturing environmental crises, and lists of officials they had paid off to look the other way. But most shocking were the recordings, meetings where Blackwood openly discussed using toxic substances to force environmental violations when other tactics failed. Emma worked through the night, cross-referencing the new evidence with cases of other farms that had been forced to sell. A pattern emerged. Mysterious soil contamination had preceded several of Blackwood's successful farm acquisitions. Each time, the farmers had been blamed for poor agricultural practices, their reputations destroyed along with their land. The State Attorney General's office moved swiftly. Search warrants were executed at Pine Grove Estate's offices and Blackwood's private residence. Documents were seized, computers confiscated, and several HOA board members were brought in for questioning. The scope of the investigation expanded to include environmental crimes, fraud, and racketeering. Our farm became the center of a storm. News crews camped out at the end of our driveway. Environmental activists arrived to show support. Farmers from across the state, some who had lost their land to similar schemes, gathered to share their stories. The quiet, rural life we had known was transformed into something entirely different. Victoria Blackwood's empire began to crumble. Pine Grove Estate's residents, learning the full extent of their HOA's criminal activities, held an emergency meeting to dissolve the board. Several of Blackwood's business partners, sensing the shifting winds, rushed to distance themselves from her organization. Banks began freezing accounts associated with her development companies. But Emma noticed something curious in the flood of media attention. Certain news outlets, particularly those with ties to large development corporations, were spinning the story differently. They portrayed Blackwood as a visionary developer being persecuted by anti-progress farmers. They questioned the authenticity of our evidence and suggested we were blocking necessary suburban expansion. The narrative shift was calculated, aimed at influencing potential jurors and swaying public opinion. We realized this wasn't just about saving our farm anymore. It had become a battle over the future of agricultural land rights. If Blackwood's tactics were legitimized, No family farm near developing areas would be safe. Mark Chen advised us to be patient, to let the legal process work, but something changed in me the night they tried to poison our orchard. These trees were planted by my grandfather, tended by my father, and now produced heirloom apples that Emma was using to preserve genetic diversity in fruit crops. The attack wasn't just on our property, it was an assault on generations of agricultural heritage. We decided to take the fight public in a way Blackwood wouldn't expect. Emma organized a Save Our Farms event, inviting the community to see firsthand what was at stake. Hundreds of people came to learn about sustainable agriculture, food security, and the importance of preserving farmland. Local chefs prepared meals using our produce. Teachers brought their students for demonstrations, and neighboring farmers shared their own stories of resistance. The event caught the attention of a national agricultural preservation organization. They saw our struggle as a perfect case study in the fight against fraudulent development schemes. Their legal team joined forces with Mark Chen, bringing additional resources and expertise to our case. Victoria Blackwood made one last attempt to regain control of the narrative. She arranged a town hall meeting, promising to address community concerns and present a new vision for agricultural preservation. But as she stood at the podium preparing to speak, something unprecedented happened. Members of her own HOA community stood up, one by one, and began reading aloud from the internal documents that had been leaked. Her carefully constructed facade cracked completely. In front of cameras and a packed audience, she lost her composure, shouting accusations and threats before being led away by her own security team. The footage went viral, becoming a symbol of corporate greed confronted by community solidarity. That evening, sitting on our farmhouse porch, watching the sunset paint the sky over our fields, I felt something shift. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued us since this ordeal began was replaced by a deep certainty. We weren't just standing our ground, we were changing the way people thought about the value of family farms and the tactics used to destroy them. Little did we know, the most dramatic chapter of our fight was about to unfold, as Victoria Blackwood prepared for one final desperate move that would either destroy everything we had fought for or expose her entire operation once and for all. The morning calm was shattered by the sound of heavy machinery. A fleet of construction vehicles bearing the logo of Blackwood Development Corporation had assembled at the edge of our property. At their head was a massive bulldozer, its blade already lowered, poised to tear into our land. Victoria Blackwood stood beside it, surrounded by a team of private security guards, waving what she claimed was an emergency demolition order. Emma was already on the phone with Mark Chen while I confronted the crew. The demolition order looked official at first glance, complete with county letterhead and official stamps. But there was one crucial detail they had overlooked. The document cited zoning codes that had been outdated for over a decade. Our attorney confirmed what we suspected. The order was another forgery, but Blackwood had anticipated our legal response. As we waited for the police to arrive, more vehicles began appearing. Local news crews, obviously tipped off in advance, gathered to film what she had planned as a media spectacle. She had orchestrated this moment carefully, counting on the cameras to capture her triumph over what she called agricultural obstruction to community progress. Maria Rodriguez arrived with a group of neighboring farmers, their tractors forming an impromptu blockade. Across our access road, students from Emma's agricultural program showed up in force, many carrying signs supporting local farms. The confrontation was quickly becoming larger than Blackwood had planned. The county sheriff arrived with several deputies, along with representatives from the zoning office. They examined the demolition order carefully, comparing it with current records on their tablets. The forgery was confirmed within minutes, but Blackwood refused to back down. She produced more documents, each one supposedly proving her authority to proceed with the demolition. As this drama unfolded at our front gate, Emma noticed something suspicious on our security feeds. While everyone's attention was focused on the bulldozer confrontation, two men were attempting to access our property from the back field. They carried professional camera equipment and what looked like environmental testing kits. She dispatched several of her students to intercept them, capturing clear video of their attempted trespassing. The men turned out to be employed by a media consulting firm with direct ties to Blackwood's development company. Their equipment wasn't for testing. It was for staging photos and videos that could be used to support false environmental claims against our farm. When confronted by the sheriff's deputies, they admitted they had been hired to create convincing evidence of agricultural violations. Victoria Blackwood's carefully planned media event was unraveling spectacularly. Instead of capturing the triumphant moment she had envisioned, the news crews were documenting her latest attempt at fraud. Her security team, sensing the shifting situation, began quietly leaving the scene. The construction crew, realizing they had been drawn into a fraudulent operation, shut down their equipment and refused to proceed. But the real turning point came from an unexpected source. A sleek corporate car pulled up, and a man in an expensive suit emerged. He introduced himself as Theodore Walsh, chairman of the board for Blackwood Development Corporation's parent company. He had been alerted to the situation by shareholders concerned about the mounting legal liability. In front of the gathered crowd and rolling cameras, Walsh publicly distanced his corporation from Victoria Blackwood's actions. He announced her immediate suspension pending a full investigation and withdrew all pending development plans involving our property. The look of betrayal on Blackwood's face was palpable. Her own corporate backers had abandoned her. Mark Chen seized the moment. He announced our intention to file additional criminal charges for the forged demolition order and the attempted fraudulent evidence staging. But more importantly, he revealed that our case had attracted the attention of federal investigators. The pattern of environmental fraud and attempted land seizures across multiple states had elevated this beyond local jurisdiction. As law enforcement began documenting the scene, Emma made a surprising discovery. Among the papers Blackwood had dropped in her hasty retreat was a notebook containing handwritten notes. It detailed not just the plan to seize our farm, but a larger strategy targeting agricultural properties across the region. The notebook included names of officials who had been bribed, dates of planned environmental incidents, and profit projections from converting farmland to development properties. This evidence proved crucial in understanding the full scope of Blackwood's operation. It wasn't just about individual land grabs. It was a systematic assault on agricultural communities designed to exploit weaknesses in property protection laws and environmental regulations. Her HOA scheme was just one part of a larger strategy to force farmers off their land. Theodore Walsh, perhaps seeking to salvage his company's reputation, offered to provide internal documents showing how Blackwood had concealed her activities from corporate oversight. His cooperation opened new avenues of investigation, revealing a complex web of shell companies and hidden transactions used to obscure the true nature of her land acquisition tactics. By sunset, the construction equipment was gone, along with the news crews and most of the spectators. Victoria Blackwood had disappeared as well, but her attempted show of force had backfired completely. Instead of demolishing our farm, she had succeeded only in demolishing what remained of her credibility. Maria Rodriguez hosted an impromptu gathering at her farm that evening. Farmers, students, supporters, and even some former Pine Grove Estates residents came together to celebrate what felt like a turning point in our struggle. The mood was cautiously optimistic, but we all knew this fight was far from over. As I walked our property that night, checking on the crops and animals, I thought about how this land had endured through generations of my family. Each crisis, each challenge, had only strengthened our resolve to preserve it. Victoria Blackwood, had thought she could break that connection through intimidation and fraud, but she had only succeeded in showing everyone exactly what we were fighting to protect. Emma joined me near the old apple orchard, her laptop glowing in the darkness. She had spent the evening analyzing the evidence we'd gathered, looking for patterns that could help protect other farms from similar schemes. "Dad," she said quietly, "I think we've just scratched the surface of what they've been doing." She was right, of course. The failed demolition attempt had given us powerful new evidence, but it had also revealed just how deep this conspiracy ran. As we prepared for the next phase of our fight, we knew that Victoria Blackwood's desperate action had changed everything, not just for our farm, but for agricultural communities everywhere facing similar threats. Emma's late-night research yielded startling discoveries. The notebook found during Blackwood's attempted demolition contained more than just plans for our farm. It held encoded references to a massive network of shell companies, each designed to hide the true ownership of targeted agricultural properties. Working through the night with a team of student volunteers, she began mapping connections between seemingly unrelated development projects across multiple states. Mark Chen brought in a forensic accountant who specialized in uncovering financial fraud. Together, they traced money flowing through dozens of accounts, each transaction carefully disguised to look legitimate. The picture that emerged was staggering. Victoria Blackwood had created an elaborate system of fake HOAs, each one serving as a front for land acquisition schemes. Theodore Walsh's cooperation proved invaluable. As the corporate chairman began providing internal documents, we discovered that Blackwood had been running a parallel operation within her legitimate development business. She used company resources and connections to identify vulnerable farms, then deployed her shadow network of HOAs to pressure owners into selling. A crucial breakthrough came when Maria Rodriguez's son, who worked part-time at the county records office, noticed something odd about recent property transfers. Farms that had been forced to sell were being immediately rezoned through expedited processes, bypassing normal environmental reviews. The paperwork showed the same notary stamp on every document, a detail that might have gone unnoticed if not for his attention to detail. The notary turned out to be another piece of Blackwood's fraud. The stamp belonged to a person who had passed away 3 years earlier, but somehow their signature kept appearing on official documents. This discovery led investigators to a small office above a local print shop, where they found equipment for creating forged documents and a cache of blank government forms. Federal agents, now fully involved in the investigation, conducted simultaneous raids on multiple properties connected to Blackwood's operation. They uncovered a sophisticated network of surveillance equipment used to monitor targeted farms, detailed dossiers on property owners, and evidence of systematic environmental sabotage. The scale of corruption was unprecedented. Local officials who had approved suspicious zoning changes were found to have received consulting fees through offshore accounts. Environmental inspectors had been paid to falsify reports. Even some real estate agents had been compensated for steering potential buyers away from farms Blackwood had targeted, creating artificial pressure to sell. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. A former Pine Grove Estates board member, racked with guilt over his role in the scheme, came forward with recorded conversations. Victoria Blackwood had been explicit in her intentions, discussing how they would break resistant farmers through a combination of legal harassment, environmental frame-ups, and social isolation. Emma organized the flood of information into a comprehensive digital database, creating a clear timeline of Blackwood's activities. Each farm targeted, each false HOA created, each fraudulent transaction was documented and cross-referenced. The pattern was undeniable. This was organized criminal activity disguised as suburban development. Theodore Walsh's company, eager to distance itself from the scandal, launched its own internal investigation. They discovered that Blackwood had used corporate resources to identify potential targets, analyzing factors like property values, zoning vulnerabilities, and owners' financial situations. She had essentially turned a legitimate development corporation into an intelligence-gathering operation for her illegal land seizures. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Maria Rodriguez received a strange phone call. A woman claiming to be Victoria Blackwood's former assistant wanted to meet, saying she had information about other farms currently under threat. The meeting was arranged at our attorney's office, with federal agents monitoring nearby. The assistant's testimony was chilling. Blackwood kept a target list of farms she planned to acquire, each one carefully selected based on specific vulnerabilities. Some were chosen because owners were approaching retirement age, others because they had outstanding loans or pending succession issues. She had mapped out a 5-year plan to systematically eliminate family farms around growing suburban areas. As news of the investigation spread, more victims began coming forward. Farmers who had lost their land under suspicious circumstances shared similar stories of harassment, fraudulent violations, and pressure from fake HOAs. Many had been forced to sign non-disclosure agreements as part of their sales, but with Blackwood's scheme now exposed, they were finally free to speak. The forensic accountant discovered something particularly disturbing in Blackwood's financial records. She had been using profits from each forced acquisition to fund the next operation, creating a self-sustaining cycle of fraud. The more farms she acquired, the more resources she had to target others. It was a predatory system designed to expand exponentially. Local environmental groups analyzing soil samples from previously seized farms found evidence of deliberate contamination. The same toxic substances found in our orchard had been used multiple times, always carefully measured to exceed safety limits without causing obvious, immediate damage. It was a calculated method of creating environmental violations that could be used to force sales. Emma's agricultural students, inspired by their role in exposing the scheme, formed a rapid response network. They offered to help other farms document suspicious activities and set up security systems. Their initiative quickly grew into a regional movement, with young farmers and agriculture students working together to protect vulnerable properties. Theodore Walsh's company, seeking to salvage their reputation, announced a new program to protect agricultural land near their developments. They pledged to create buffer zones around existing farms and include conservation easements in their planning. It was a corporate acknowledgement that sustainable agriculture and suburban development could coexist. State legislators, responding to public outrage over the scandal, began drafting new laws to protect agricultural properties from fraudulent HOA claims. They proposed stricter oversight of homeowners associations, mandatory notification systems for zoning changes, and enhanced penalties for environmental fraud targeting farms. As the evidence mounted, Victoria Blackwood's carefully constructed world continued to unravel. Her former allies turned against her, each one seeking to protect themselves by revealing more details about her operation. The woman who had once boasted about her ability to reshape the suburban landscape was now watching her empire crumble from behind closed doors. But even as we made progress in exposing the truth, Emma reminded me that our work was far from finished. There were still farms on Blackwood's target list, still families facing pressure from fraudulent HOAs, still agricultural communities at risk. The foundation of her scheme had been exposed, but dismantling it completely would require sustained effort and vigilance. The fight had evolved from protecting our own farm to defending a way of life that was under threat across the country. Each new piece of evidence, each testimony from another victim, reinforced the importance of what we were doing. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about preserving agricultural heritage and protecting food security for future generations. The federal investigation took a dramatic turn when investigators discovered a hidden room in Victoria Blackwood's private office. Behind a false wall, accessed through a concealed panel, they found a comprehensive archive of her operations. Meticulously organized files detailed every farm she had targeted, complete with surveillance photos, personal information about owners, and strategies for forcing sales. Among these documents was something that made my blood run cold: a detailed analysis of my family's history, including information about my late wife, Sarah. Blackwood had researched our financial records, medical history, and personal relationships, looking for vulnerabilities she could exploit. She had even compiled psychological profiles, attempting to predict how we would react to different forms of pressure. Emma was particularly disturbed by the discovery of drone footage showing our daily routines. The timestamps indicated surveillance had begun months before Blackwood's first official contact with us. There were detailed notes about Emma's research work, her connections in the agricultural community, and even transcripts of her university lectures on sustainable farming. Mark Chen immediately filed additional charges related to stalking and invasion of privacy. The extent of surveillance went far beyond what could be justified for legitimate business purposes. It demonstrated a level of premeditation that transformed this from a property dispute into something far more sinister. Maria Rodriguez organized an emergency meeting of local farmers at her barn. Representatives from over 30 agricultural properties gathered to share information and compare experiences. Many discovered they had been under similar surveillance, their daily activities monitored and documented without their knowledge. The sense of violation was profound. Theodore Walsh's company, facing mounting pressure from shareholders, launched a comprehensive audit of all their development projects. They discovered that Blackwood had embedded her surveillance operation within legitimate security contracts, using corporate resources to gather intelligence on potential targets. The company's reputation was in tatters, its stock price plummeting. As each new revelation emerged, a breakthrough came when federal agents interviewed Blackwood's private security team. Several members, facing criminal charges themselves, agreed to cooperate. They revealed that Blackwood had maintained a separate communication system, using encrypted devices to coordinate surveillance and harassment activities. These communications provided concrete evidence of her direct involvement in every aspect of the scheme. Emma's students, analyzing the surveillance data, identified a pattern in how farms were selected for targeting. Blackwood focused on properties that served as keystones in local agricultural communities, farms that, if forced out of operation, would create cascading effects on neighboring agricultural businesses. It was a strategy designed to weaken entire farming regions, making other properties more vulnerable. The former HOA board member, who had come forward earlier, provided additional context. Blackwood had regularly held secret meetings where she outlined her vision for transforming agricultural areas into luxury developments. She spoke openly about using environmental regulations as weapons, manipulating property values, and exploiting legal loopholes to force farmers off their land. State environmental officials, reviewing years of inspection records, found that Blackwood had systematically corrupted the regulatory process. She had created a network of compliant inspectors who would produce fraudulent violations on demand. The same toxic substances found in our orchard had been used repeatedly, always in amounts calculated to trigger violations without causing obvious damage. The forensic accountant uncovered something even more disturbing in Blackwood's financial records. She had been selling options on targeted properties before beginning her harassment campaigns. Investors would buy the right to purchase land at predetermined prices, knowing that Blackwood's tactics would force owners to sell below market value. It was a sophisticated form of agricultural property fraud that had generated millions in illegal profits. Local law enforcement, executing another search warrant at Blackwood's residence, discovered a room filled with maps and aerial photographs. Every agricultural property within 50 miles had been marked and categorized. Color-coded pins indicated different stages of her acquisition strategy: properties under surveillance, those facing active harassment, and those she planned to target next. Emma spent days documenting everything, creating a comprehensive digital record of Blackwood's operation. She worked with cybersecurity experts to analyze the encrypted communications, building a timeline of coordinated actions against various farms. The evidence painted a picture of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years. Theodore Walsh's company, attempting to salvage something positive from the scandal, announced a partnership with agricultural preservation groups. They committed to establishing protected agricultural zones around their existing developments, ensuring that suburban expansion wouldn't threaten viable farmland. It was a corporate acknowledgement that their previous development model had been fundamentally flawed. Maria Rodriguez's son, continuing his work at the county records office, identified another aspect of Blackwood's scheme. She had been manipulating property tax assessments through a network of corrupt officials, artificially inflating the tax burden on targeted farms while securing favorable rates for her developments. This financial pressure had forced several farmers to sell before her other tactics even began. The federal investigation expanded to include wire fraud and racketeering charges. Blackwood had used interstate banking systems to launder proceeds from her forced acquisitions, creating a complex web of transactions designed to hide the source of her profits. Each new financial discovery strengthened the case against her. As winter approached, Emma organized a conference on agricultural land protection at the state university. Farmers, legal experts, and environmental scientists gathered to discuss strategies for preventing similar schemes in the future. The event became a catalyst for legislative reform, with state representatives in attendance pledging to strengthen protections for agricultural properties. The scope of Blackwood's operation continued to grow as more evidence emerged. She had maintained detailed psychological profiles, not just of target property owners, but of local officials, business leaders, and community members who might influence her plans. She had mapped out power structures in each community, identifying who could be bribed, pressured, or manipulated. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Maria Rodriguez discovered old aerial photographs of the region. Comparing them with current maps, she identified a pattern in how Blackwood had selected her targets. She had been systematically eliminating farms that controlled key water rights, attempting to gain control of regional water resources along with the land. This revelation added another dimension to the case. It wasn't just about real estate development. Blackwood had been orchestrating a takeover of essential agricultural resources. By controlling water rights, she could have exerted pressure on surviving farms, even without direct ownership of their land. The growing body of evidence against Blackwood revealed a scheme more elaborate and far-reaching than anyone had initially suspected. It had evolved beyond simple land acquisition into an attempt to fundamentally reshape the agricultural landscape of entire regions. The question now was how the morning tranquility of our farm was suddenly disrupted by urgent knocking at the door. Maria Rodriguez stood on our porch, clutching a stack of weather-worn documents she'd discovered while cleaning out her family's old barn. The papers, dating back to the 1950s, revealed something extraordinary: a long-forgotten watershed agreement that connected all the farms in our valley. Emma immediately recognized the significance. Victoria Blackwood hadn't just been targeting random agricultural properties, she had been systematically acquiring farms that controlled key points in the regional water system. The ancient agreement proved that all our properties were legally interconnected through water rights that predated modern property laws. Mark Chen was on his way to court when we called, but he immediately turned around and came to the farm. As he pored over the document, his expression grew increasingly animated. These water rights represented a legal foundation that could invalidate many of Blackwood's already completed acquisitions. Properties she had seized through fraudulent means were bound by water-sharing obligations she had never disclosed to her investors. Federal investigators, already deep into Blackwood's financial records, found new significance in seemingly unrelated transactions. She had been quietly buying up small parcels of land around natural springs and watershed areas, creating a hidden network of water control points. Combined with her forced farm acquisitions, it amounted to an attempt to monopolize the region's water resources. Theodore Walsh's company faced fresh scrutiny when investigators discovered internal memos discussing the water rights strategy. While Walsh claimed ignorance, documents showed that corporate planners had been aware of the potential to control regional development through water access. The company's stock price, already battered by the scandal, plunged to new lows. Emma organized an emergency meeting at our farm, bringing together hydrologists, agricultural experts, and affected farmers. Using satellite imagery and the old agreements, they mapped out how Blackwood's acquisitions formed a strategic pattern around water sources. She hadn't just been building luxury developments, she had been creating a private water empire. Maria's discovery sparked a wave of similar findings. Farmers across the region began digging through family records, uncovering more evidence of the interconnected water system. Ancient easements, shared maintenance agreements, and historical maps showed how the agricultural community had once worked together to manage water resources. The State Water Resources Board launched their own investigation, realizing that Blackwood's schemes had implications for regional water security. They found that several of her development projects had already begun altering historical water flows, potentially impacting agricultural properties miles away from her actual acquisitions. A breakthrough came when Emma's students, analyzing satellite data, identified unauthorized modifications to natural waterways on properties Blackwood had acquired. She had been quietly altering the landscape to redirect water flow, creating artificial scarcity in some areas while ensuring surplus supply to her developments. The forensic accountant discovered a separate set of books dedicated to water rights acquisitions. Blackwood had been spending millions to buy up small water claims, often through shell companies that appeared unconnected to her development operations. When combined with her forced farm acquisitions, it revealed a strategy to control not just land, but the very resources needed for agricultural survival. Local environmental groups, reviewing years of water quality data, found patterns of deliberate contamination at key watershed points. The same toxic substances used to create environmental violations on individual farms had been strategically deployed to impact water supplies across wider areas. It was environmental warfare on a regional scale. Mark Chen filed amended legal complaints incorporating the water rights evidence. The case now extended beyond individual property rights to include violations of historical water agreements, environmental protection laws, and public resource regulations. The scope of Blackwood's crimes had expanded dramatically. Theodore Walsh's company, desperately trying to contain the damage, announced plans to restore historical water flows and transfer water rights back to agricultural users. But the complexity of the interconnected system meant that simply undoing Blackwood's changes would be a massive undertaking. Some alterations to the landscape were potentially irreversible. Emma worked with university researchers to document the historical water management system. Using ground-penetrating radar and advanced mapping techniques, they identified ancient irrigation channels, natural springs, and water control points that had been part of the valley's agricultural infrastructure. For generations, Blackwood's developments had disrupted this delicate balance. State legislators, recognizing the broader implications, began drafting new laws to protect historical water rights and prevent similar schemes in the future. The investigation had exposed dangerous gaps in existing regulations that had allowed private interests to gain control of essential public resources through property manipulation. Maria Rodriguez, inspired by the water rights discovery, organized a coalition of family farms to revive the old watershed management system. They began developing plans to restore historical water flows and create new agreements that would protect agricultural water access for future generations. The federal investigation uncovered Blackwood's endgame, a plan to create artificial water scarcity that would force the remaining farms out of business regardless of property ownership. By controlling key water resources, she could make agriculture impossible even on properties she hadn't managed to acquire directly. Emma's agricultural students, working with local conservation groups, began documenting the environmental impact of Blackwood's water manipulation. They found evidence of disrupted wildlife habitats, altered wetlands, and damaged ecosystems extending far beyond the boundaries of her actual properties. The scale of the water rights conspiracy highlighted the vulnerability of agricultural communities to coordinated attacks on their resources. What had begun as a simple property dispute had revealed systematic efforts to undermine the foundations of regional farming through control of essential water supplies. As winter snow began falling on our fields, we realized that preserving our farm meant more than just protecting our own property. We were part of an interconnected system that had sustained agriculture in this valley for generations. Blackwood hadn't just attacked individual farms. She had attempted to destroy an entire agricultural ecosystem. The water rights revelation transformed our understanding of what we were fighting for. This wasn't just about land ownership or property rights anymore. It was about protecting the natural resources that made farming possible, about preserving a system of water management that had evolved over generations to support sustainable agriculture. The investigation had opened a new chapter in our struggle against Blackwood's schemes, revealing layers of conspiracy that extended literally underground through the water that connected all our farms. But it had also shown us the strength of our agricultural community and the importance of working together to protect our shared resources. A secure USB drive arrived at our farm by special courier, containing files from a whistleblower deep within Blackwood's financial empire. The data revealed a shocking international dimension to her schemes. Foreign investment groups had been quietly backing her operations, using her tactics to gain control of American agricultural land through elaborate corporate structures. Mark Chen immediately brought in specialists in international financial law. The foreign connections transformed the investigation into a matter of national security, drawing attention from federal agencies concerned about foreign control of domestic food production. Blackwood hadn't just been stealing farms. She had been facilitating the covert takeover of American agricultural resources. Emma spent sleepless nights analyzing the financial data with help from university economists. They uncovered a network of offshore accounts linked to shadowy investment firms, each designed to hide the true source of funding behind Blackwood's operations. The money trail led through tax havens and shell companies across 3 continents. Theodore Walsh's company, found itself under renewed scrutiny when investigators discovered meetings between corporate executives and foreign investors. While Walsh claimed these were routine business discussions, documents showed they had specifically discussed using HOA schemes to acquire agricultural properties for overseas interests. Maria Rodriguez noticed something peculiar in the land: records of recently forced sales. The properties weren't being transferred directly to Blackwood's development companies, but were passing through a series of intermediate entities before ending up under foreign control. The complex chain of ownership made it nearly impossible to trace the final beneficiaries. The forensic accountant identified a pattern in the international money flows. Funds would move through multiple jurisdictions, changing currency several times before arriving in accounts controlled by Blackwood's organization. Each transaction was structured to avoid regulatory oversight and hide the connection to agricultural land acquisitions. Federal investigators brought in experts in sovereign wealth fund operations. They discovered that several foreign governments had been using Blackwood's network to quietly accumulate control over strategic agricultural resources. Her local HOA schemes were just the visible front for a much larger operation aimed at securing foreign influence over American food production. Emma organized a briefing for state agricultural officials, presenting evidence of how foreign interests were using seemingly legitimate development projects to gain control of key farming regions. The revelations sparked immediate concern about food security and the vulnerability of agricultural communities to international financial manipulation. Mark Chen filed new legal motions incorporating the international evidence. The case now included allegations of violations of foreign investment, regulations, agricultural security laws, and national defense considerations. What had started as a local property dispute had evolved into a matter of national significance. Local farmers, learning about the foreign connection, began investigating the ownership histories of nearby properties that had been forced into sale. They discovered that many farms acquired through Blackwood's tactics were now effectively under foreign control, though hidden behind layers of corporate ownership. Theodore Walsh's company faced potential national security investigations. The revelation that they had knowingly participated in schemes to transfer agricultural resources to foreign control threatened not just their reputation, but their ability to operate in sensitive sectors of the economy. State lawmakers, alerted to the national security implications, began drafting legislation to protect agricultural land from covert foreign acquisition. The investigation had exposed dangerous vulnerabilities in existing regulations that allowed foreign interests to gain control of essential food production resources through complex corporate structures. Emma worked with cybersecurity experts to analyze communication patterns between Blackwood's organization and foreign entities. They uncovered encrypted messages discussing long-term strategies for acquiring control of entire agricultural regions through coordinated financial and legal pressure on family farms. The scale of the international conspiracy stunned even experienced investigators. Blackwood had created a sophisticated system for circumventing agricultural foreign ownership restrictions, using her HOA schemes and environmental harassment as tools to force properties into a pipeline that ultimately led to overseas control. Maria Rodriguez discovered that several agricultural support businesses in the region, seed suppliers, equipment dealers, and processing facilities, had also fallen under foreign control through similar schemes. The strategy extended beyond farm acquisition to include the entire agricultural supply chain. Local environmental groups, reviewing satellite data, identified patterns of land use changes on foreign-controlled properties that suggested a shift away from food production toward other purposes. The agricultural character of the region was being systematically altered through coordinated management decisions. Emma's students, Analyzing crop data from affected farms found that previously diverse agricultural operations were being converted to standardized production models that aligned with foreign investment strategies. The unique character of local farming was being erased in favor of corporate efficiency. The federal investigation expanded to include tools used in counter-espionage operations. Investigators discovered that Blackwood's organization had employed sophisticated surveillance and data collection methods typically associated with state-level intelligence gathering, suggesting direct foreign government involvement. State agricultural officials began examining how foreign control of local farms was affecting food security and market stability. They found evidence that production decisions on controlled properties were being influenced by international economic strategies rather than local agricultural needs. The revelation of foreign involvement added unprecedented complexity to the legal proceedings. International law experts were brought in to address questions of jurisdiction and enforcement, as many of the entities involved operated beyond the reach of local courts. Theodore Walsh's company, facing multiple federal investigations, began disclosing details of meetings with foreign investors. Internal documents showed that executives had been aware of plans to use environmental regulations and HOA policies as tools for facilitating foreign acquisition of agricultural properties. Mark Chen worked with national security lawyers to develop new legal strategies that addressed both local property rights and international ownership issues. The case now required coordination between multiple federal agencies and consideration of diplomatic implications. The investigation revealed that Blackwood's water rights scheme had also been part of the international strategy, control of water. Resources would give foreign interest leverage over regional agricultural production, regardless of direct property ownership. Emma organized a conference bringing together agricultural experts, national security analysts, and local farmers to discuss the implications of foreign investment in agricultural communities. The event highlighted the need for new approaches to protecting domestic food production from covert foreign control. As winter deepened, the investigation continued to uncover new layers of international involvement in what had appeared to be a local land grab. Each revelation showed how vulnerable agricultural communities had become to sophisticated financial schemes operating on a global scale. The fight to protect our farm had evolved into something far larger than we had initially imagined. We were now part of a national effort to preserve agricultural independence and protect essential food production resources from covert foreign control through seemingly legitimate business operations. Victoria Blackwood made her final desperate move at dawn, but this time she badly miscalculated. A fleet of private security vehicles swarmed our farm, carrying teams of men in tactical gear. They claimed to be enforcing an emergency public health order, brandishing documents that alleged our farm was the source of a severe agricultural contamination threatening the entire region. Emma was already awake, monitoring our security systems when the invasion began. She immediately activated our emergency response protocol, a system we had developed after months of dealing with Blackwood's schemes. Within minutes, live video feeds of the incident were streaming to our attorney, law enforcement, and a network of agricultural advocates across the state. Mark Chen mobilized instantly, his voice sharp with urgency as he coordinated with federal authorities. The timing wasn't coincidental. Blackwood had launched this operation just hours before a scheduled court hearing that would have exposed the full scope of her international connections. This was a last-ditch effort to destroy evidence by seizing control of our property. Maria Rodriguez and her family arrived first, their trucks forming a defensive line across our main access road. Other farmers followed, responding to our emergency alert system. They understood that this wasn't just an attack on our farm, it was an assault on the entire agricultural community's right to exist without corporate interference. The private security teams, clearly unprepared for organized resistance, hesitated. Their scripts and rehearsed procedures fell apart in the face of united opposition. When they attempted to present their fraudulent health order, Emma was ready with documentation proving our recent environmental certifications and testing results. Theodore Walsh's company, already under federal scrutiny, immediately distanced themselves from the operation. Their legal team sent urgent notifications denying any involvement, while corporate security provided evidence that Blackwood had used stolen company resources to organize the raid. The county sheriff arrived with a full tactical team, having been warned by Mark Chen about potential escalation. They found themselves facing a private army operating without legitimate authority on American soil. The implications of such a force being deployed against civilian farmers triggered immediate national security concerns. Emma's students, who had been staying at the farm to help document evidence, proved invaluable. They maintained live streams of the confrontation, ensuring that every action was recorded from multiple angles. Their presence as witnesses made it impossible for Blackwood's team to control the narrative. The fraudulent health order quickly fell apart under scrutiny. It had been crafted using outdated templates and forged signatures, revealing Blackwood's desperation. She had abandoned any pretense of legal procedure, resorting to brute force in a final attempt to silence those who threatened to expose her. Operation Mark Chen's preparation proved crucial. He had anticipated potential escalation and prepared emergency injunctions that were immediately activated. Within hours, federal judges in 3 jurisdictions had issued orders prohibiting any interference with our farm operations pending full investigation of the attempted raid. Maria Rodriguez's son, monitoring social media from the county records office, caught something crucial. Blackwood's security teams had been recruited through international military contractors, raising serious questions about the use of foreign mercenaries on domestic soil. This evidence transformed a property dispute into a matter of national security. The forensic accountant traced the funding for the operation through a maze of offshore accounts. The money trail led back to several foreign entities that had been quietly backing Blackwood's attempts to gain control of American agricultural resources. The raid wasn't just about our farm. It was part of a larger strategy to destabilize domestic food production. Local law enforcement, coordinating with federal agencies, began detaining members of the security team. Many carried false identification and questionable credentials, suggesting connections to foreign intelligence operations. The investigation had uncovered a sophisticated network of operatives working to undermine agricultural independence. Emma worked with cybersecurity experts to protect our digital evidence, as Blackwood's team attempted to breach our farm's security systems. They documented multiple attacks on our networks, each one traced back to overseas servers connected to entities involved in the agricultural takeover scheme. Theodore Walsh's company faced immediate congressional inquiry. The revelation that private security forces were being deployed against American farmers using corporate resources sparked bipartisan outrage. Walsh found himself struggling to explain how his organization had become entangled in what appeared to be a foreign attack on domestic agriculture. Mark Chen coordinated with national security lawyers to address the international dimensions of the case. The attempted raid had provided concrete evidence of foreign interference in domestic agricultural operations, strengthening our legal position and drawing attention from agencies responsible for protecting critical infrastructure. Maria Rodriguez organized an emergency meeting of regional farmers to share security protocols and strengthen community defenses. The attack on our farm had demonstrated the vulnerability of agricultural operations to paramilitary pressure, leading to new cooperative agreements for mutual protection. The State Agricultural Department, recognizing the broader threat, began implementing emergency measures to protect farming communities from similar tactics. They established rapid response teams and created new protocols for verifying the legitimacy of inspection orders and enforcement actions. Emma's agricultural students developed a comprehensive security framework for farming operations, incorporating lessons learned from the attempted raid. Their work became a model for protecting agricultural properties from both legal and physical threats orchestrated by corporate interests. The federal investigation expanded to examine how private security forces had been allowed to organize and deploy against civilian agricultural operations. They uncovered a pattern of similar incidents across multiple states, all connected to attempts by foreign interests to gain control of domestic food production. Local environmental groups documented how Blackwood's security teams had attempted to plant false evidence of contamination during the raid. Their quick response helped prevent the fabrication of environmental violations that could have been used to justify the forced closure of our farm. State legislators, shocked by the paramilitary operation against civilian farmers, began drafting new laws to prevent the use of private security forces in agricultural disputes. The incident had exposed dangerous gaps in existing regulations that allowed corporate interests to deploy armed personnel against farming communities. As federal agents processed members of the security team, they discovered that many had backgrounds in foreign military operations. The use of international mercenaries to target American farmers represented an unprecedented escalation in the battle for control of agricultural resources. Emma worked through the night to compile evidence from the raid, creating a detailed record of how foreign interests had attempted to use paramilitary force to seize control of domestic agricultural operations. Her documentation would prove crucial in upcoming legal proceedings and policy discussions. The attempted raid had failed, but it had revealed the true stakes of our fight. This wasn't just about protecting individual farms. It was about defending American agricultural independence from sophisticated foreign operations disguised as local development disputes. The final showdown unfolded in a packed federal courthouse where Victoria Blackwood sat stone-faced as prosecutors presented their case. The evidence assembled over months of investigation painted a damning picture of international conspiracy, environmental terrorism, and systematic attacks on American agricultural communities. But what happened next stunned even the most seasoned legal observers. A senior executive from Theodore Walsh's company approached the prosecution during a brief recess. He carried a secure laptop containing encrypted communications that Blackwood had tried to destroy during the raid on our farm. The messages revealed direct coordination between her organization and foreign intelligence services, discussing plans to destabilize domestic food production through targeted attacks on family farms. Emma, testifying as an expert witness, methodically outlined how Blackwood's scheme had evolved from simple land grabs to a sophisticated operation aimed at undermining agricultural independence. Her presentation included satellite imagery, soil analysis, and financial data that demonstrated the systematic nature of the attacks on farming communities. Mark Chen's legal strategy proved masterful. Rather than focusing solely on individual crimes, he showed how each action was part of a larger conspiracy to transfer control of essential agricultural resources to foreign interests. The attempted raid on our farm became the centerpiece of his argument, demonstrating how corporate forces had been willing to use paramilitary tactics against American farmers. Maria Rodriguez brought other farmers to testify, each sharing similar Stories of harassment, environmental sabotage, and attempted property seizures. Their collective testimony revealed a pattern of coordinated attacks on agricultural communities, all traced back to Blackwood's network of fake HOAs and shell companies. The forensic accountant presented a devastating analysis of money flows between Blackwood's organizations and foreign entities. He demonstrated how millions of dollars had been channeled through offshore accounts to fund operations against American farms, including the recruitment of private security forces for the raid on our property. Local law enforcement officials testified about their discovery of surveillance equipment, forged documents, and evidence of environmental tampering found in Blackwood's offices. Their evidence showed how she had built an intelligence gathering operation specifically targeted at agricultural properties marked for acquisition. Theodore Walsh himself took the stand, attempting to distance his company from Blackwood's crimes. But under cross-examination, he was forced to admit knowledge of meetings with foreign investors where plans to acquire agricultural properties through coercive tactics were openly discussed. State environmental officials presented their findings on deliberate contamination attempts at multiple farms. They revealed how Blackwood's teams had used precisely calculated amounts of toxic substances to create violations, following a playbook designed to force farmers into selling their land. Emma's students shared their documentation of the raid on our farm, including video evidence of armed personnel attempting to plant false evidence of environmental violations. Their testimony highlighted the escalation from legal harassment to paramilitary tactics in Blackwood's desperate final effort to silence opposition. The prosecution's case culminated with evidence from the encrypted communications found on Blackwood's devices. Messages revealed explicit discussions of using HOA regulations, environmental laws, and private security forces as weapons against agricultural communities that resisted foreign acquisition attempts. As the evidence mounted, Blackwood's composure finally cracked. In an unexpected outburst, she defended her actions as necessary for progress, claiming that family farms were obsolete and that corporate control of agriculture was inevitable. Her tirade only served to reinforce the prosecution's portrayal of her contempt for agricultural communities. The jury took less than 6 hours to reach their verdict. Blackwood was found guilty on all counts, including conspiracy, fraud, environmental crimes, and unauthorized use of private security forces. The judge, citing the national security implications of her crimes, imposed the maximum sentence on each charge. Beyond the criminal convictions, the case sparked immediate legislative action. Congress fast-tracked new laws protecting agricultural lands from foreign acquisition through shell companies. States began implementing stricter oversight of HOA formations and environmental enforcement actions near farming communities. Theodore Walsh's company faced its own reckoning. Shareholders demanded complete disclosure of all involvement in Blackwood schemes, leading to a major corporate restructuring and new policies prohibiting development projects that threatened agricultural operations. The international dimensions of the case led to diplomatic investigations of foreign entities involved in attempting to gain control of American agricultural resources. Several countries found themselves facing sanctions for their role in supporting Blackwood's operations against domestic farms. Maria Rodriguez led efforts to create a regional agricultural protection network, implementing security protocols and early warning systems developed from lessons learned during our fight. The network became a model for other farming communities, facing similar threats from corporate development interests. Emma's work documenting the case became the foundation for new academic programs focused on protecting agricultural communities from corporate exploitation. Her students developed innovative approaches to combining traditional farming practices with modern security measures. The former board members of Blackwood's fraudulent HOAs faced their own legal consequences. Many agreed to testify about how they had been recruited into the scheme, providing valuable insights into how similar operations might be identified and prevented in the future. State environmental agencies revised their inspection procedures, implementing new safeguards against fraudulent violation claims. They created special units trained to recognize and investigate potential environmental warfare against agricultural properties. As spring returned to our valley, the changes brought by our fight became evident. New protective easements ensured that agricultural lands would remain in food production. Water rights were permanently secured for farming use. Foreign acquisition attempts through shell companies had been blocked. Standing in our apple orchard, watching the trees bloom for another season, I reflected on how our struggle had transformed from defending one farm to protecting an entire way of life. The ground beneath our feet, passed down through generations, remained secure, not just for our family, but for all who understood the true value of agricultural independence. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.